lesson this week is called In a Battle. And the key verse that I found was Exodus 14:14. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. And we'll refer to that later. A few weeks ago, I think that was recorded, on God's ironic providence accompanied by human courage. And we talked about the amazing things that happened at Moses' birth that saved him, and the courage of especially the women, the midwives who lied to Pharaoh at the cost of their lives, and luckily they didn't get killed. The Moses' mom who hid him for 3 months, that was brave, and then took him to the river in a basket and let him go, trusting that God would do something with him. His sister Miriam, who kind of followed this verse, she stood still in the bulrushes and watched to see what would happen, and never would have dreamt the princess would come. And that was a mighty thing that God did. And then the princess herself that took Moses, knowing he was a Hebrew, and took him as her own at the risk of really getting her father's wrath at the least. So that was really fun. And then a few weeks ago, I say 2 weeks ago, it was probably 3 weeks ago for you guys, Christina talked on the plagues. And mostly those were done by God, but Moses had his hand in it. And the last plague, the Israelites had to do something. They had to do the Passover. Remember, you guys did the Seder meal here too. It was so touching to me. I really enjoyed that. But they had to do what God said. They had to be really exact. It was not that easy to follow. And then they had to put the blood on the doorposts to save their firstborn. And so God did a lot of it, but they had to obey. And this week, I think our passage is mostly on the power of God. And that's what I want us to think about tonight. I want to pretend like you've never heard the story before. The story of Moses crossing the Red Sea is pretty famous, but and we get kind of just used to it. But as we just go through this, I want us to really think of the amazing, awesome power of God and what the Israelites really experienced going through that Red Sea. So the key verse, as I said, it's a little longer in this one. It says, "Stand firm and you will see the deliverance of the Lord. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." And I found that verse, I think years ago, maybe in Jesus Calling or something. I thought, that is a really cool verse. But I didn't know the context. And I thought, oh, it's in this context. And Moses is telling the Israelites to do that. So I hope that as I just review this story, I'll bring out some things that maybe you haven't thought of, or I got some ideas from commentaries I thought would be helpful. So Pharaoh let the people go after all those plagues, and God led them on a not very direct route to get to Canaan. And I was thinking, why would he do that? And it's because he knew that the Philistines were in the land. If they'd gone on a direct route, they would have gone through Philistine country, and they were warriors that plagued the Israelites for years. And if you remember, Goliath was a Philistine in the time of David. And as ex-slaves, the Israelites weren't prepared yet. They weren't the warriors that they would become. And God knew they weren't ready to fight. So it made me think sometimes God leads us in longer directions. You think, why am I doing this and not just going straight to something? But maybe they feel like the desert times, but maybe he's trying to protect us from something like he did the Israelites. Or maybe he's doing it for our growth, for something important ahead. So when we're in those times, remember the Israelites, and God had a real purpose for them wandering a little bit. And then also, as they were leaving, Moses took Joseph's bones. It says, honoring Joseph's request. In Genesis, he had asked his sons, made the sons of Israel swear, saying, when God has taken notice of you, you shall carry my bones from here. So Joseph believed they were going to be freed when God takes notice of you. So he believed that God would rescue him, and now it's happening. And Moses, I thought, how faithful of a man. He didn't forget all he had to do. He remembered to carry Joseph's bones with him. As they traveled, God led them by a pillar of cloud in the day and cloud at night. There it is. I think that's kind of a cool picture. And this was another really miraculous sign to the Israelites. We kind of just hear about that. I thought God was really there in the cloud with them. And there's a quote that says, I got from a commentary, that the main function of the pillar was a way of allowing the Israelites to look at God so as to be able to follow him without actually seeing him in his very person. Because as we remember when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, he couldn't really look at God, and even his face was so shining when he came down, he had to put a veil on. But God was there. It was really Yahweh himself. And I thought, just think about that. God himself was moving in front of the Israelites, showing them the way to go. And then they're just moving along, okay, and then God says, you're going to take a radical turn and turn back and encamp near some funny name town between Migdol and the sea. And they said, we don't even really know quite where they were, but they were going towards the sea. And it must have looked funny to someone watching if they're going on this route and then all of a sudden they turn almost the opposite way. And they weren't so far from Egypt that the Egyptians couldn't know what they were doing. Maybe, I was thinking, they sent spies out to watch the Israelites and what was happening. But it was God's divine ruse to fake out the Egyptians one last time. And God's goal from verse 14:4 says, can't really read it, but I love that thing, that God is powerful. And he says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart and he will pursue them, but I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites were marching originally boldly, and they went to where God said without complaining or questioning. That didn't happen very often with the Israelites. And I thought, well, it's really easy to follow God, isn't it? When everything's going well and his commands seem to make sense to us, and when the directions aren't too hard. But the Israelites, just like we are, have trouble when danger comes. And in this case, they were terrified when they looked back and saw the Egyptians in sight. And I can imagine what a scary thing that must have been. So what had Pharaoh been up to back at the ranch? He had been putting together 600 of his best chariots along with other chariots and had his army and officers take off to go get their former slaves back. He realized what a loss it was not to have their slave labor. And I got this thing from a commentary. It said, what made Pharaoh think that he could go and get the Israelites after all the plagues? I mean, that takes a lot of nerve. And this commentary said that Egyptian goddesses and gods were arbitrary and capricious. They were quick to change their action and attitudes, constantly vying for power over one another, not omnipresent like our God, but manifesting themselves at given locations. They'd be one place and then they would leave them, moving around. And Pharaoh might have thought that our God was like that. And he had been so present in Egypt that maybe now the gods were kind of tired and they were going to move on, or God would move on and wouldn't be directly involved anymore. Anyway, that was an interesting thought, that maybe that's what gave Pharaoh a little more nerve to go after them again. And I thought, boy, he was in for the surprise of his life, wasn't he? Because our God is not like their God. And I think a lot of people today will be in shock about Jesus who don't believe in him. I love that verse in Philippians that said, when the end comes, every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. And Yahweh was showing the Israelites how he was Lord, and also the Egyptians. So Pharaoh heads out with his whole army, and all of them will see the power of God. The Israelites see them coming, possibly 1,000 chariots maybe, and marching men. And first they cried out to God. And I thought, well, at least they cried out to the right person at first. But then they turned and quickly started complaining to Moses. And this will be a pattern. And I just can hear them, Moses, Moses, what have you done bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt to leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Moses, Moses, what have you done? Maybe they might have actually said something like that, leave us alone, when Pharaoh increased their workload as a result of Moses' demands. But now it comes in handy to blame Moses. And so this is called recovered memory. They remembered what they had said back in Egypt, and they used it to their advantage. But you know what? They could have stayed in Egypt. No one made them leave. No one was complaining when they were freed. But now they're saying that the Exodus is a bad idea. And they were actually wrong, because the Israelites weren't coming to kill them. They were coming to take them back as slaves, exactly what they were asking for. So that's kind of ironic. And the Israelites also did not believe that God would rescue them. And I again want to bring it back to us. How do we act in crisis? Maybe when we've ventured out on something, a limb that God's called us to, and it doesn't go well, you think, Lord, why did I come here? It doesn't work. It doesn't feel good. And I was trying to think of an example from my life when I did that, and it's not a great one, but it goes back a long time ago. I joined Campus Crusade staff when I got out of college, and our whole goal was to share our faith with people, and we worked in the Greek system, so we spoke in sororities and the guys in fraternities. And I had watched some of my friends, and I was a little bit scared of sororities because I went to a Christian college. We didn't have sororities, and I thought they were real sophisticated, and I was afraid to talk. Finally, I thought, okay, Lord, it's my turn. I'll go give my testimony. And my testimony is hard to give for me anyway because I've mostly always been a Christian since a little girl. It wasn't real exciting, like I did these horrible things. Anyway, I got up to give it, and about halfway through, my mind went totally blank. And my mind doesn't usually do that. I can usually come up with something, but I was so surprised that I couldn't recover very fast, and I was so embarrassed. And I ended up finishing it. But I went out, I can remember walking and crying, and I thought, I made such a fool of myself. I'm never doing this again. Lord, I don't ever want to go back there. And I thought, if I had just lived that way and said, I'm done, because I felt like I was sort of a rock and hard place. I was at a job where I had to do it. I didn't want to do it. And I eventually did it. And that gave me the foundation for all the speaking I've done for the last 50 years. So sometimes God puts us in hard places, but then he comes through. And I know many of you have been there. You might be right now between the Egyptian army and the Red Sea. And I want to ask you, just think through this tonight. What is your Red Sea? What maybe has it been, or is there a Red Sea in front of you that doesn't look like it will part? And I'm hoping that this lesson will encourage us that God can do anything. And in this case, he used Moses. And I think God brings Moseses into our life sometimes to help us. And there's a lot of neat women in this church, in this Bible study, and it's okay to ask for help when we're facing the Red Sea. Use our friends. They want to help. They want to come alongside us, and you might be the Moses for someone. But I love Moses' response when they're complaining. He's totally trusting God, and I think this is probably one of his best leadership things up to this point. And again, my favorite verse, but adds a little bit more to the previous one. It says, do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. I mean, what a promise, isn't that? The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. And God fights for his people, and the Israelites will see this again and again in the next years as he takes them in to conquer the promised land. And I thought that same God will fight for us. And I love that thought. Today, I think what he's given us more is the armor of God. We're supposed to put the armor of God on daily and take our stand against the devil's schemes. And I love a verse in Ephesians 6:18 that says, therefore, put on the whole armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. And after you've done everything, to stand. Kind of the same as the verse here in Exodus. We don't always get to see the miracles that the children of Israel got to see, do we? But we have the Holy Spirit in God's armor. He does many miracles for us in lots of little ways. So back to our story, and coming now, I think, to the amazing climax of going across the Red Sea. The Israelites crossing, and then the Israelites being drowned. And I sang to my oldest son, Jonathan. You might not know him, you all know Dave. If he would be out when he was a little boy and fall asleep in the car, that meant nap time was over. And so I would try to keep him awake, driving in the car. He's probably 2 or 3. And there's this great song called How Did Moses Cross the Red Sea? Anyone heard that? Y'all probably not quite. Your kids weren't young enough, and you're not young. I don't know. Anyway, I sang it for Wednesday morning. I'm not going to do that tonight. But it kind of is, how did Moses cross the Red Sea? And then it goes, did he run? Did he walk? Did he sail? Did he fly? No, 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 no. Do you know that last? That'd be good for your Sunday school. Did he run? No, no. Like, how did he get across? I'm always going that to my son. How did he get across? Trying to keep him awake. And it ends with God blew with his wind, puff, 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 and he blew just enough. And then he opened up the sea for them to go across. It's a cute song. And I also had a fun experience about this miracle when I was on Campus Crusade staff. We were at a conference, and this guy came up to me and asked what we're doing. You know, and they always think we're a little weird. And he said, oh, I don't believe all that stuff about the Bible. You know about Moses crossing the Red Sea? It really wasn't the Red Sea. It was the Reed Sea, which is only 3 feet deep. Have you heard this? And so they easily could have got across. And so for once I had a good answer, and I said, well, I'll give you that. But then it's even more of a miracle that the whole Egyptian army drowned in 3 feet of water. And he didn't have an answer for that one. But even as I was reading this story again and studying it, I had that thought, how are the Israelites going to get across the Red Sea before the Egyptians catch them? And it's kind of like, a movie that you've already seen before, but there's a scary climax and you know the end, but you still get really nervous. And that's how I was feeling. Or like you take maybe a football game. We've been watching football a lot. And I've already seen it. And I know who wins, but in the third quarter, it looks like there's no way that your team's going to win. And that's kind of how I felt about the Israelites. How can they really have enough time to get across? Well, God figured it out. And in verse 19, it says that an angel of the Lord who had been traveling in front of Israel's army went behind the people, and the pillar moved from the front to the back of them, coming between the Israelites and the Egyptians. And that must have been so cool. Whoops, we're too far ahead. Yeah, just that one. Okay, thanks. So the cloud came and it brought darkness on one side and light on the other. And we live in a place where we have a lot of fog. And you know how thick that can be. And I thought God often uses natural phenomena in supernatural ways. And he did that with this cloud. And so it offered the chance for the Israelites to escape. And I love this picture. It said Moses stretched out his hand and probably had the staff, the rod that he used for the miracles of the plagues. And God drove back the sea with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. And I just think that must have been an awesome thing to have experienced. And the waters were divided, and they walked through with them on their right and their left. And according to a commentary, some skeptics think that the sea was shallow, and a regular wind could actually have blown the path. But the word here in the scripture is, in Hebrew, it's called homa, and it means a very large wall, not like a little small wall, but maybe like city walls. So it was huge on either side, and the sea denotes a large body of water. So I think most of us believe this story to be true, but it's nice to know that those words really mean that. And this would be an experience that the Israelites hopefully would never forget. And about 40 years later, when they actually entered the promised land, they sent, remember the story, sent spies into Jericho to spy out the land, and they met Rahab, who hid them. And she said to them, this is in Joshua 2:9, I think this is so amazing. So this was 40 years at least past this time. She said, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and how you conquered kings. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord, your God, is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Here's a lady, Canaanite lady, 40 or so years later, believing in our God. I thought she had more faith than many of them. So God's power was noticed by, this story must have just spread, which you can imagine. So the Egyptian army pursued them, thinking that if it worked for the Israelites, well, it should work for us. And chariot wheels get stuck easily in mud or wet sand, and so they must have thought it was dry enough to get across. So all of them followed, the Israelites had already passed, so they followed them into the sea. And this was interesting to me. It's believed that Pharaoh and his advisors never actually went into the sea. They might have turned around when that cloud hit. And if that's true, I always think, what did Pharaoh think when he got to see the power of God and realized his whole army was gone? And you can just imagine that they must have been really scared, but it'd be really hard to go back and tell Pharaoh, you know, we saw thousands of Israelites crossing, but we were afraid to go in. So they went in to chase them. And I just wonder what happened to Pharaoh. But there's also a verse in there that talks about God throwing the army into confusion and making the wheels come off the chariot, so they had trouble driving. And the Egyptians said, the Lord is fighting for them. And so they were scared. So they probably went in with a defeatist attitude already, but they did it. And they believed somewhat in God's power, I think. Must have been scary. They didn't have Israel's assurance that God was with them. And I thought the army feared Pharaoh and they died. The Israelites feared God and they lived. And that's true for us. Again, another amazing sight. As they were charging into the sea, Moses put out his hand on the other side, and the waves came over and buried all the Egyptians, and not one survived. I thought, wow. And it was done at daybreak. That I thought was interesting. So all the Israelites could watch and see that happen. Can you imagine that? Thinking, here's their enemies coming after them, and God just took care of them. An interesting sidelight. If they were typical of most ancients, virtually none of them could swim. Should make it more scary. And swimming was not an Olympic sport till 1869, just for your information. What was the response of the Israelites at this point? In verse 31, it says, when the Israelites saw the great power of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. They were beginning to learn who their God was, because they probably didn't see things like that in all those years in slavery in Egypt. And I thought of Moses, he could have been a little prideful. He thought, I just stretched out my hand and look what happened. But he didn't take any glory. He gave it all to God. And it said of Moses in Numbers 12:3 that he was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. That's not a beautiful way to talk about him. He gave God all the glory. And in Deuteronomy, I found this. It says, it's kind of a eulogy to Moses. And it says, listen what it says about Moses when he died. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and all the officials, and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in sight of all Israel. Wouldn't that be something to have said of you? Moses was a great man. He stood and watched God work and gave him all the glory. And it made me think, when God parts our Red Sea, one you might have been in or when you will be in one, it's great for us to give credit to the Lord, not take it for ourselves, and to tell others of what he did. Telling others helps us remember. The Israelites were so excited at this point, but they didn't remember very well. And when new trouble hits, they complain again and wish they were back in Egypt. We don't want to be like them. But for now, their enemies, the Egyptian army, are destroyed, and that was the last time Israel had to ever deal with them. I love it when it feels like Satan has been defeated and we can have peace for a while. Peace is nice. So I was kind of thinking about this for the last couple of weeks. I kept trying to think of more applications from this lesson, and I was working on it, but I came to the conclusion that the story mostly speaks for itself. And what I hope we will come away with tonight is what an amazing and awesome God we serve. And we use that word awesome for a lot of things, but truly, the real meaning is God is awesome. He acts on behalf of his people, Israel, and he acts on the behalf of us who are believers so many years later. A magnificent and powerful God that loves us, and he desires fellowship with us. The God that parts the Red Sea wants to be part of our lives. And I thought that should bring us a sense of wonder and praise and gratefulness and humility and obedience. When God acts like that, we want to obey. Acting in obedience with courage and action when God calls for that, and obedience in standing still when he calls for us just to watch him. And I think sometimes that's the hardest for us, isn't it? To stand still and watch. And we were talking about this in my small group, and a lady in my group was in a position where she just felt she was struggling, and she used the word picture of being caught in a trap, and she just wanted to get out of it. So she kept trying to pull her leg out, it would just grab her leg instead of just trusting God. And we asked her, did you finally get out of the trap? And she said, well, I didn't change the circumstances, but I stood still and let God work. And I thought that was a neat example of that idea. But both take action, and both to be still takes faith. And we need faith, and so do the Israelites. And I was thinking this is a faith-building story, if we've ever had one in the Bible. It's so amazing. So I want us to go from this place tonight knowing our God is amazing and awesome. And maybe you need to hear that tonight. Sometimes when we're in hard places, we forget the God that we serve. And so I, instead of a prayer to close with, I wanted to close with some scripture. And I forgot to bring my Bible in. Does anyone have a Bible I can borrow? I think I left it in my car. On the phone?
We have Bible, it's just that a different version.
I don't care.
What do you?
Exodus 15.
What do you?
Thank you. I brought my Bible study book and my Bible, but here, thank you. This is a song that Moses wrote almost spontaneously right after the crossing of the Red Sea. They don't think it took very long. And it was sung by all of Israel, and then his sister Miriam led the women in worship with it. And so, just as our prayer, I want to read a little bit of it, because the story that we've just read is pretty just basic. This and this and this happened, but his prayer tells more about his praise and the wonder and his emotions, and you might have done that in your lesson. So I'm just going to close with this. Okay. Does it move up or up? That way, okay. Thank you. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he cast into the sea. He picked officers. His picked officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down into the depths like stone. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrew your adversaries. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, and the earth swallowed them. In your steadfast love, you led the people whom you redeemed, and guided them by your strength to your holy abode. Amen. I think that's a neat ending. Thank you.